Imagine this. You work 60 hours a week. You save every dollar you can. You skip vacations. You eat at home. You do everything right. And still, you cannot afford a one-bedroom apartment in your own city. Now imagine finding out that while you are struggling, while young families are cramming into basements and seniors are choosing between rent and groceries, there are 58,000 homes sitting completely empty, not under construction, not being renovated, just empty, collecting dust while an entire generation is locked out of the housing market. That is not a hypothetical nightmare. That is Toronto in 2024, and the mayor just had to face the music. If this is your first time here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we break down stories like this every single week, stories that the mainstream media glosses over but actually affect your life. Trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming. Now let me take you back to the moment that sent shockwaves through Canadian politics. Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow stood at a press conference, surrounded by reporters, facing questions she clearly did not want to answer. The data had just been released. 58,000 homes in Toronto were sitting vacant, while the city experienced the worst housing affordability crisis in its history. The numbers were not coming from some fringe blog or angry Reddit thread. They came from Statistics Canada, from the city's own analysis, from researchers who had spent months combing through utility data, census records, and property assessments. And there was no hiding from it. When pressed about what the city was doing, Chow's response was telling. There was no confident defense of policy. There was no triumphant announcement of solutions. Instead, there was visible frustration, deflection, and what many viewers described as a complete breakdown of composure. She stumbled through explanations about jurisdictional limits, provincial barriers, and the complexity of the housing market. But for the thousands of Torontonians watching at home, people who have watched their rent double in a decade, people who have given up on ever owning property, those excuses rang hollow. Let me put these numbers in perspective for you because they are absolutely staggering. 58,000 empty homes. That is not a small figure you can wave away. To understand how significant this is, consider that Toronto welcomed roughly 65,000 new immigrants in 2023 alone. The city has a wait list of over 80,000 families seeking affordable housing. There are an estimated 10,000 people experiencing homelessness in the Greater Toronto Area on any given night. And yet, enough homes to house all of them, and then some are sitting vacant. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Maybe these homes are vacant for legitimate reasons. Maybe they are in the process of being sold, or the owner passed away, or they are undergoing renovation. And yes, there is always a natural vacancy rate in any housing market. Experts typically say a healthy vacancy rate sits around 3%. It allows for mobility, for turnover, for the natural churn of people moving in and out. But Toronto's numbers blow past that threshold. We are looking at a vacancy rate that suggests something far more systemic is happening. The truth is, a significant portion of these empty homes are being held as investments. And I am not talking about your neighbor who bought a rental property to fund their retirement. I am talking about a fundamentally broken system where housing has become a speculative asset, a place to park money rather than a place to live. Foreign investors, domestic speculators, numbered corporations, and yes, even some pension funds, have turned Toronto's housing stock into a casino. Buy a condo, let it sit empty, watch the value appreciate, sell for a profit. Rinse and repeat. The fact that a family could have lived there, that a young couple could have started their life there, that a senior could have aged with dignity there, is completely irrelevant to the spreadsheet. And here is where it gets really infuriating. The city has had a vacant home tax in place since 2022. On paper, it sounds great. If you own a home in Toronto and leave it empty for more than 6 months, you pay a tax of 1% of the property's assessed value. Later, they bumped it up to 3%. Politicians patted themselves on the back. Problem solved. Right? Wrong. The tax is based on self-declaration. That means homeowners have to voluntarily report that their property is vacant. Take a wild guess how many people are honestly reporting that their million-dollar investment property is sitting empty. The compliance rate has been laughable, enforcement has been almost non-existent, and the revenue generated, while not nothing, has done almost zero to actually bring those homes back into the market. When Chow was asked about strengthening enforcement, about actually putting teeth into the vacant home tax, the response was a masterclass in political deflection. She talked about studying the issue, about consulting with stakeholders, about working within fiscal constraints. Meanwhile, the crisis is not waiting for another study. It is getting worse by the month. Average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto hit $2,500 in late 2023. Some neighborhoods are seeing prices north of $3,000 for a one-bedroom. Think about that. A young professional earning $60,000 a year, which is above the median income, would need to spend half their pre-tax salary just to afford a modest apartment. After taxes, we are talking about 70% of take-home pay going to rent. That is not a housing market. That is indentured servitude. But the empty homes are only part of the story. They are a symptom of a much larger disease. For decades, Canadian policymakers at every level of government have treated housing as an investment vehicle rather than a basic necessity. Federal policies encouraged home ownership as a wealth-building strategy. Provincial governments failed to build enough social housing. Municipal governments bent over backward to accommodate developer interests, while blocking density in wealthy neighborhoods. The result is a perfect storm where demand has been artificially inflated, while supply has been deliberately constrained. And who pays the price? Not the investors sitting on empty condos in Yorkville. Not the politicians who go home to houses they bought 20 years ago for a fraction of today's prices. Not the developers who have made billions off the artificial scarcity. The price is paid by the young couple who cannot afford to have children because they cannot afford a second bedroom. The price is paid by the immigrant family who came to Canada for a better life, only to find themselves in a bidding war for a basement apartment. The price is paid by the essential workers, the nurses and teachers and grocery store clerks, who literally cannot afford to live in the city where they work. There is a term that economists use called rent-seeking behavior. It does not actually refer to collecting rent from tenants. It refers to extracting wealth without creating any value. And that is exactly what is happening in Toronto's housing market. Empty homes are the purest expression of this dysfunction. Someone is profiting off the appreciation of an asset while contributing nothing to the community, while that asset could be providing shelter to someone who needs it. Now let us talk about what could actually be done, because this is not an unsolvable problem. Other cities around the world have faced similar crises and taken bold action. Vancouver, Toronto's neighbor to the west, implemented a speculation and vacancy tax that is significantly more aggressive. It is audited and enforced, not self-declared. Properties identified as vacant face financial penalties substantial enough to actually change behavior. Singapore, a city-state with even more limited land than Toronto, uses a combination of public housing and strict regulations on foreign ownership. Over 80% of Singaporeans live in government-built housing. Vienna, Austria, has been building and maintaining social housing for over a century. Today, roughly 60% of Vienna's residents live in subsidized housing, keeping the entire market affordable for everyone. These are not radical socialist experiments. They are pragmatic policy choices made by governments that decided housing was too important to leave entirely to the market. And yet, when similar ideas are proposed in Toronto, they are met with hand-wringing about property rights, concerns about government overreach, and warnings about unintended consequences. The unintended consequences of inaction are already here. We are living them. A generation locked out of home ownership, a rental market that consumes half of people's income, homelessness increasing year after year, communities hollowed out as workers are pushed further from their jobs. How much worse do things need to get before bold action becomes politically viable? What frustrated people most about Mayor Chow's response was not just the lack of solutions, it was the lack of urgency. She was elected on a platform of housing affordability. She promised to be different from her predecessor, to bring a progressive vision to City Hall, to fight for working families, and yet when confronted with 58,000 empty homes, the response was bureaucratic caution, more consultations, more studies, more waiting for the provincial or federal government to act. The people of Toronto did not elect her to wait, they elected her to lead. To her credit, Chow has taken some steps. The city has proposed increasing the vacant home tax rate again. There have been discussions about using city-owned land for affordable housing development. Some progress has been made on cutting red tape for housing approvals, but the scale of the response does not match the scale of the crisis. 58,000 empty homes demands emergency action. It demands treating housing like the human rights issue that it is. Instead, we get incremental policy tweaks while the market continues to spiral out of control. The generational divide on this issue is stark, and it is contributing to a level of social tension that should worry everyone. Older Canadians, many of whom bought homes decades ago when prices were a fraction of current levels, often struggle to understand the desperation of the younger generations. Phrases like, "just work harder," or "when I was your age" ring hollow when the math simply does not work. A home that cost $100,000 in 1990 now sells for over $1 million. Wages have not increased tenfold. The rules of the game have changed completely, but the people who benefited from the old rules are still offering advice as if nothing has changed. This generational wealth gap is creating a two-tier society. Those who got into the market early, or who had family help, or who simply got lucky, are building generational wealth. Their homes appreciate year after year. They can borrow against their equity. They can help their own children get into the market. Meanwhile, those locked out are watching their rent consume their savings, unable to build any wealth, falling further behind every single month. This is not just an economic issue. It is a social cohesion issue. It is a democratic legitimacy issue. When an entire generation feels that the system is rigged against them, when they see 58,000 empty homes and know they cannot afford a place to live, faith in institutions erodes. The political implications are significant. Housing affordability consistently ranks as one of the top concerns for Canadian voters. Politicians who fail to address it do so at their peril, and yet meaningful action remains elusive because the interests aligned against change are powerful. Homeowners, who make up the majority of voters in many ridings, benefit from rising prices. Developers and real estate interests are major political donors. The entire financial system is built on the assumption that home prices will continue to rise forever. Challenging this status quo means challenging powerful constituencies. But here is the thing: the status quo is not sustainable. You cannot have a city where workers cannot afford to live. You cannot have a society where housing insecurity is the norm for an entire generation. You cannot have 58,000 empty homes and 10,000 homeless people and pretend everything is fine. Something has to give. The only question is whether the change will be managed and deliberate, or chaotic and painful. What Toronto needs, what Canada needs, is political courage. Leaders willing to say that housing is a human need, not a speculative asset. Leaders willing to impose meaningful penalties on those who hoard empty homes. Leaders willing to build social housing at scale, to reform zoning laws, to take on the vested interests that profit from scarcity. This is not about left versus right. It is about whether we believe that everyone deserves a place to call home. The 58,000 empty homes in Toronto are a monument to political failure. Every one of those units represents a policy choice, or more accurately, a failure to make policy choices. Every empty condo in a gleaming tower downtown, every boarded-up house in a transitioning neighborhood, every investment property sitting vacant in the suburbs, they are all symptoms of a system that has prioritized wealth extraction over human well-being. And Mayor Chow's breakdown, her visible discomfort when confronted with these numbers, shows that even those in power are running out of excuses. As we look ahead, the path forward requires all of us to stay engaged, to stay informed, to keep pressure on politicians at every level. Municipal, provincial, federal, they all have roles to play. And they all need to hear from citizens who are fed up with empty promises and empty homes. The housing crisis will not solve itself. It will take organized, sustained political action. It will take voting for candidates who actually have plans, not just platitudes. It will take calling out the special interests that benefit from keeping things exactly as they are. For those of you watching this from other cities, do not think this is just a Toronto problem. The same dynamics are playing out in Vancouver and Montreal, in cities across Canada and around the world. The financialization of housing, the treatment of homes as investment vehicles, the failure to build enough supply to meet demand, these are global phenomena. What happens in Toronto matters not just for the millions who live there, but as a test case for whether democratic societies can solve these kinds of problems at all. So the next time you hear a politician talking about housing affordability, ask them about the empty homes. Ask them what they are actually going to do about it. Not study it, not consult on it, do about it. Because 58,000 empty homes in a city with a homelessness crisis is not a policy puzzle. It is a moral emergency. And the breakdown we saw from Mayor Chow, while understandable, is not what people need. They need action. They need leadership. They need politicians who understand that housing is not just about markets and taxes and jurisdictional boundaries. It is about people. It is about families. It is about the fundamental question of whether ordinary citizens can build a decent life in the city they call home. If this video opened your eyes to what is really happening in Canada's housing market, do me a favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel and lets me know you want more content like this. Drop a comment below telling me what you think. Should the government be doing more about empty homes? Have you been personally affected by the housing crisis? I read every single comment, and your perspective matters. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. We are going deep on these stories, the ones that actually affect your life. And I appreciate every single one of you who is part of this community. Stay informed, stay engaged,